much for spending some time with us here today. We've got about 36 folks with us online, which means we're about halfway to quorum. And I know in webinar world, about half counts as starting. So thank you everyone so much for joining. And why don't we get started? My name is Madeline Rose. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Climate Campaign Director for Pacific Environment. And I'm so excited to be moderating today with many friends here on the panel. We are so excited to kick off our webinar, How Clean Shipping Policies Can Improve Air Quality and Save Lives. We have allies, community organizers, and policymakers here from us today from across the country. We have Washington, Hawaii, California, and Oregon. We have Washington Port Commissioner Fred Fellman with us, port staff from across the country, including we see New York, New Jersey, Virginia, New Orleans, and Los Angeles. So a real great group, and we're so grateful. Again, I can't see everyone, but I'm sure many friends and allies that we do know. Today we've got, I think, a great run of show for us. We're going to be providing an overview of opportunities to accelerate zero-emission maritime and port transformation to significantly reduce air quality and health, and to create better air and better climate outcomes at our port communities. We're going to be presenting an overview of some of the nation's most progressive zero-emission and low-emission port policies, including California's landmark shore power policy and its hovercraft regulation. We're also going to be walking through new research by the International Council on Clean Transportation that quantifies the public health benefits and the climate benefits of these policies and future policies like them to be replicated in other port communities. And we're going to be hearing directly from the US EPA about federal funding opportunities and tools that are available to ports right now under the Biden administration to put these policies into place, to operationalize them, and to achieve emissions reductions. Our agenda today will go first. We'll hear from Teresa Bowie of Pacific Environment, who will give an overview of the California shipping policies mentioned and talk about how those can be replicated and adopted across the country. Second, we'll hear from Dr. Brian Comer of the International Council on Clean Transportation, who will be sharing the results of a new landmark ICCT study that quantifies emissions benefits at major US ports. Third, we'll hear from Terrence Bankston with the Friends of the Earth, who will be talking about results from the New York and New Jersey port hubs specifically. And we'll talk about opportunities for port electrification on the East Coast and the important environmental justice implications of going faster, bigger, and bolder. Finally, fourth, we'll hear from Sarah Froman with US EPA, who will be talking specifically about the federal funding opportunities and tools that are available to make all this happen. And then we should have about 25 minutes for Q&A. So please feel free to jot your questions as we're going through. Feel free to jot your questions in the chat, write them down, and I'll turn it over to you. So with that, it's a very general overview. Again, thank you so much for being here, and I am turning it over to Teresa Bowie, my dear colleague, to kick us off.
Great, thanks, Madeline. All right, I'm going to share a screen. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Good morning, and thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Teresa Bowie. I'm the Climate Policy Director with Pacific Environment. Today, I'm going to be talking about California shipping policies and how it can help reduce ship and port pollution. For those who haven't heard of PE, we're a global environmental nonprofit headquartered in San Francisco, dedicated to protecting communities and the environment around the Pacific Rim. We held a permanent consultative status with the International Maritime Organization, which is a UN body that sets global shipping laws. And we are committed to getting ships off fossil fuel and working to advocate for policies and actions around the world that advances a clean and equitable global shipping sector. We have two major campaigns called Ship at Zero and Ports for People. Our Ship at Zero campaign is a corporate public pressure campaign urging some of the largest retailers in the world, Amazon, IKEA, Walmart, and Target, to take responsibility for their ocean shipping pollution and to commit to shipping their goods on zero emission vessels. And then our Ports for People campaign is a local to global policy advocacy campaign to end fossil fuel pollution from ships. We work with frontline communities, allies, and decision makers to stop fossil fuel build-out and putting ships on a mandatory zero emission pathway. So why ships? We have just fewer than 10 years to transition the economy off fossil fuel to prevent the worst climate impacts. Every year, shipping emits more than 1 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide, or 3% of the total greenhouse gas emissions, more than all coal plants in the US combined, or the entire national emissions of Germany. If we're to defeat existential climate crisis, shipping cannot be ignored. And so not only is there a climate imperative to decarbonize shipping, studies have shown that shipping emissions were attributable to 265,000 premature deaths globally every year. And most ships are currently relying on the dirtiest fossil fuel available in the market, which is the heavy fuel oil, which releases asthma and cancer-causing pollutants when burned. And so here in the US, nearly 40% of Americans live within 3 miles of a port, and ships are a major source of fossil fuel pollution in these communities. It is a fast-growing sector due to our globalizing economy, and so could cause up to 17% of global greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 if we don't do something about it. So what can we do about it? There are a few different policies out there that have already been proven to work. I'll start with one, requiring shore powers at port. The California Air Resources Board, or CARB, adopted the ocean-going vessel at berth regulation in 2007 to regulate pollution from ships that emit while docked. So what does at berth mean? We can think of ships at berth as idling, like car idling. Even when they're docked at ports and not moving, ships continue to emit pollution. So the at berth regulation requires ships at berth to plug into shore power to electricity rather than running on dirty diesel engine. The 2007 rule applies to container, reefer, and cruise vessels at 6 California ports, and to either plug into shore power or use an alternative CARB-approved emission technology to reduce emissions from NOx and diesel particulate matter at berth. These include emission capture devices. Since compliance began in 2014, the regulation has decreased emission from vessels by 80%. However, port communities and the environment remained impacted by the air pollution from ships at berth. And so in 2020, CARB adopted an update to the 2007 regulation that added additional vessel categories and port terminal. The new vessels include auto carriers and tanker vessels. And it also changed from a 25 visit fleet-based threshold to a more health protective 20 visit per terminal based threshold. And then, as I mentioned, the regulation has a staggered implementation schedule with implementation for container, reefer, and cruise vessels January 1st this year. And then 2025, that's when auto carriers have to comply. And then tanker vessels in Los Angeles and Long Beach have to comply in 2025. And tankers in Northern California in 2027. So for California, the health benefit will be huge. And you'll also hear from Brian on the health benefits to other regions. As you can see from this chart, the regulation is expected to reduce cancer risk near the port of Long Beach, LA, and Richmond by 55%, and estimated to save 237 lives, yielding $2.31 billion in public health benefits, while also reducing pollution by 90%. This is about 17,500 tons of NOx and more than 356 metric tons of CO2. And beyond the health and environmental benefits, there's also a jobs benefit. Continue and expanded investment in zero emission technologies and infrastructure at ports and in the maritime sector provides opportunities to create reliable and well-paying domestic union jobs. For instance, establishing shore power in just one port of Long Beach Terminal, Pier C, created 60 high-paying union jobs. Next, we'll be talking about the California Commercial Harborcraft Rule. Last year, Pacific Environment worked with a coalition of environmental and environmental justice groups to get the Harborcraft Rule passed in California. So what are hovercrafts? In this instance, what we're talking about are cruise and supply boats, pilot boats, excursion vessels, tugboats, barges, dredges, and other vessel types that are in and around the harbor area. And so CARB first adopted the Commercial Harborcraft Rule in 2009. It was a performance standard applying to hovercraft vessels in California, including requiring newly acquired engines to meet current US EPA marine engine standards such as Tier 2 and Tier 3. However, air pollution from these vessels can remain a public threat to public health. And so as hovercrafts were the top 3 cancer-causing risks at the ports. And so in March 2022, CARB updated the regulation to accelerate emission reductions, with requirements phasing in starting January 1st of this year. So the newest rule contained 4 major provisions. One, it mandated zero-emission new excursion vessels and zero-emission short-run ferries to be by 2025 and 2026 respectively. And then for all other regulated vessels requiring the cleanest certified engines, either Tier 3 or Tier 4, with a diesel particulate filter or a zero-emission alternative technology pathway. It also required use of renewable diesel starting this year, and then providing zero-emission and advanced technology credits for early adopters. Similarly, at full implementation, the regulation is expected to provide considerable health and environmental benefits. It's expected to reduce diesel particulate matter by 89%, NOx by 54%, and greenhouse gas emission by 415,000 metric tons, avoiding 531 premature deaths and yielding $5.25 billion in public health benefits. And then this not only impacts port communities, the impacts to inland resident is also huge. The cancer risk reduction here, as you can see from the chart, you can see for San Francisco and Long Beach, the reduced cancer risk is to over 22 million residents, and the reduction in terms of the amendments is 100 per million for 80,000 residents in the study area. And what's more is that the technology exists. Shout out to ABB Marine, who have been working with Crelli to create the first electric tugboat, the E-Wolf, on your left. That will be in San Diego port later this year. And then on your right, you can see the Sea Change, which is already operational in SF water later sometime in June. This one is running on a hydrogen fuel cell ferry. According to DNV, there's currently 589 harbor craft ships in operation right now and 208 battery operated ships on order. And last but not least, I just wanted to flag one more rule, which is the California Low Sulfur Fuel Standard. This one, it limits the sulfur content of vessel fuel. CARB adopted the rule in 2008 to reduce particulate matter, NOx, and SOx, and limit sulfur levels for fuels to 1% by weight. And the good news is the IMO adopted this standard in 2020, and NASA has shown that the global sulfur, they've hailed it as a success in terms of reducing the ship track, especially once the IMO has adopted the rule. And with that, we also have fact sheets available for all of these different policies in case you're interested. Thanks for spending time with us today. We'll be happy to answer questions at the end, and I will pass it over to my colleague, Brian.
Thank you very much, Teresa. All right, share my screen. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to this this webinar. We're really excited to share some results of a new study on electrifying ports to reduce diesel pollution from ships and trucks and benefit public health. We have two case studies that I'm going to present on, one for Seattle and one for New York, New Jersey. But we hope that the methods that we have used for these two ports can be used at other ports in the United States and also globally as well. The lead author, his name is Jihong Meng. He's out of our Beijing office where it's at 3 o'clock in the morning. So I'll be presenting, but I want to be clear that the modeling is really his good work. The ICCT, we're an international independent nonprofit research organization. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C., which is where I'm calling in from, but we have offices globally. And we're really interested on my team how regulators can reduce, eliminate, and avoid altogether pollution from the shipping sector, including from ports. For this study, we looked at Seattle and New York, New Jersey. These are two major ports on opposite coasts of the United States. Both of them also have ambitions for net zero greenhouse gas emissions in 2040 for Seattle and 2050 for New York and New Jersey. And the other impetus for this study was that we have a new opportunity with the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Both of them provide additional funding to programs that ports can use to fund zero emission projects for shore power, harborcraft retrofit and replacement, and even port electrification master planning as a first step. Available now through the Port Infrastructure Development Program, for instance, is $700 million per year, up from $250 million before those two laws were passed. On the previous slide, there's a link to the full study that you can download. We wanted to know how can port electrification reduce air pollution, improve air quality, and benefit public health in U.S. ports, given the opportunities that we have now with additional funds. We use two tools. Both of them are publicly available and free. The first one is ICCT's global online port emissions inventory tool called GoPEIT. It estimates emissions from ships, hovercraft, like Teresa was just mentioning. That would include tugs and ferries, trucks, other sources based on activity and fuel consumption. And it's based off of a model that Transport Canada developed, but we've updated it so that it reflects global emission factors and can be used around the world. One of the early applications was to do an emissions inventory for Jakarta, Indonesia. We paired that with the intervention model for air pollution. This model is also free, publicly available. And what that does is if you tell the model how much air pollution, in this case fine particulate matter, is emitted in a port, then or any area, but we're applying it for ports, it will estimate how that affects the air quality, where that air pollution goes, who's affected by it, what are the health impacts. In this case, it looks specifically at premature deaths, and then it can also monetize those health damages based on the value of a statistical life. These are maps of the study areas. So we've limited our study to the areas where the ships and the trucks would be operating at the terminals. There's other ship activity in this area, but we wanted to make sure that we were capturing the ships that were actually surfacing these ports. Now let's get into some of the results. So this is an emissions inventory for the Port of Seattle developed using the global online port emissions inventory tool. We estimate 19 tons of fine particulate matter emitted in 2019, and most of this is from, on the shipping side, from cruise ships, container ships, ferries, and tugs. These are all important sources. We estimated that under a full electrification scenario, which we defined as shore power for the marine vessels that call on the port, completely zero emission hovercraft either through battery, electric, fuel cells. Either of those options are fine. Would reduce emissions by 75% of fine particulate matter. And the shore power alone reduces in-port fine particulate matter pollution by 29%. Harborcraft reduces emissions by 45%. And what's left over are the emissions from the ships when they are coming into the berth, and also their boiler emissions. So any of those emissions are not eliminated using shore power. So that's what remains. These maps show you on the left-hand side the difference in fine particulate matter concentration before and after the full electrification scenario. And then on the right-hand side, it shows you the benefit of reduced air pollution on right. So the darker the color, the greater the reduction in air pollution. And then on the right-hand side with the pink and purple, that shows you how the public health benefits are distributed. And the way we've looked at this is avoided premature mortality health benefits in terms of thousands of dollars based on the value of a statistical life. So the area, you'll notice that the area that's affected by port air pollution greatly reduces, an over 80% reduction. And it also represents a 4 to 6% reduction in the annual average fine particulate matter pollution concentrations from all sources in Seattle, just by through Harborcraft electrification and from shore power. Each year, just taking those actions would avoid 3 premature deaths per year, and that represents $27 million per year in public health benefits. And quantifying these health benefits it's sometimes controversial because, you know, how do you actually put a dollar value on a human life? But it is useful if you're going to be applying for funding and you're trying to demonstrate that there are benefits on the side of the ledger, one side of the ledger, and not just costs. This is what the emissions inventory looks like for the Port of New York and New Jersey. For this port, we were also able to include not only ocean-going vessels and harborcraft, but also drayage trucks. So in the Port of New York and New Jersey, we estimated 72 tons of fine particulate matter. Big contributors from container ships and tankers and tugs. And then drayage trucks are about 1/5 of the PM 2.5 fine particulate matter air pollution emissions. Under the full electrification scenario, same as in Seattle, but in this case, we also assume that the drayage trucks are zero emission vehicles. In that case, you can cut PM 2.5 emissions 68%. Shore power is 16% of that. Harborcraft electrification is 30%, and drayage trucks about 1/5. The remaining emissions, again, are from the ships when they're coming in and their boiler emissions. Similar idea on the distribution of the benefits, the air pollution reduction benefits. So on the left-hand side, we see the air pollution before and after the electrification scenario. You'll again see a really large reduction in the affected area, the area affected by the pollution. And then the public health benefits are on the right-hand side. Significant benefits in Elizabeth City, New Jersey, and also in Brooklyn, New York. Total concentration of particulate matter represents 9 to 11% reduction in the annual average fine particulate matter pollution from all sources in the New York City area. So actually fairly significant. And in this case, we're saving 16 premature deaths per year. It's a very densely populated area. So any reductions in air pollution are going to have some of these expected benefits. And then that translates into $150 million per year in public health benefits. That's about 10% of the annual budget of New York City's Department of Health. Takeaways from our study: port electrification can greatly reduce air pollution emissions. And in Seattle and New York, we're expecting about 3 premature deaths avoided in Seattle and 16 in the New York City area, translating to $27 million and $150 million, respectively, per year in public health benefits. And the tools that we used are free and relatively user-friendly. The ICCT's Global Online Port Emissions Inventory tool is available at gopeit.org. There's a tutorial video available for it. There's also, when you go into the tool, a number of tips as you go through. But I just want to emphasize that the ICCT is happy to help any port produce their own emissions inventory results. We can adjust the emission factors to suit your needs. We can show you how to put data into the model and make sure that you get something useful out of it. To be clear, this is a basic emissions inventory. It does have updated emission factors from the 4th IMO greenhouse gas study, which are state of the science for ships. It uses EPA's MOVES and non-road model, which is now incorporated into MOVES in the background for the on-road vehicles and for the off-road vehicles. But if you want to, it gives you an idea of where the sources of pollution are, where you might want to prioritize, what are the opportunities for reducing pollution at the port, and a relatively good sense of what proportion those different sources make up of your inventory. So it can really help when you're trying to decide what you ought to do. And some of these bigger ports, including New York, New Jersey, and Seattle, have their own emissions inventories. We compared our results from this to theirs, which you can see in the full study. They line up fairly well. But those studies cost tens of thousands of dollars to produce. They're very detailed. They're very high quality. This is a free tool that you can use to get a good sense of just what the magnitude of emissions might look like in the distribution. InMap is available at inmap.run. There's good documentation on that model as well. So I'd like to thank you for your attention. I know we have Q&A coming up later. If there's anything that I can't answer today, please reach out to us. Our emails are here on the screen. You can reach out to me or Jihong. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks so much, Brian, and thanks so much, Teresa. In addition to being very substantively dense and wonderful presentations, you're also right on time. I'm just jumping in the middle here before we pass to Terrence to remind folks that you can ask questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I apologize for not flagging that at the top, but thank you to Mark and Kim for getting us started. So again, we're halfway through here on presentations. Please feel free to send questions as they come up. We will be able to answer some of them written while we're going here, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion at the end. So again, the Q&A button is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I unfortunately can't chat you, so if you have any problems, chat a friend, phone a friend on Zoom. Otherwise, hopefully you can see the Q&A button clearly at the bottom. Okay, Terrence, over to you. Oh, Terrence, you're muted.
Hi, I'm Terrence Bankston, and thank you all. Depending on where you are, I will say good day to you. I am the Senior Ports and Freight Campaigner for Friends of the Earth here in the United States. My colleague and I, John, we direct organizing, coordination, advocacy efforts in the Mid-Atlantic, Southeast, and Northwest regions, ideally to reduce air pollution from port and freight activity, and also bridging the gap really between port communities and environmental justice and other non-port communities. With that being said, we'll get on with the first slide. bridging the gap between New York and New Jersey ports and our community justice, our environmental justice communities. And so I wanted to share from this slide just some research. It says air pollution from port activities has been linked to higher rates in asthma, heart disease, cancer, early death in those that live, work, and go to school near them. Part of this presentation from President Earth is not just to highlight New York and New Jersey opportunities, growth possibilities, and enhancements that have already occurred. It's also to shed light on perhaps some myths that air pollution from ports do not impact our communities. And so this presentation is not just a formal presentation, it's also a testimony, as I am from Essex County, New Jersey, and here we do suffer from port pollution that comes from our airport. In fact, majority of our absenteeism in Essex County is due to asthma. Next slide. We also wanted to highlight the workers, the laborers. Just up a little bit, I'm sorry. The laborers as well. And so when we talk about environmental justice communities and non-port communities, we cannot leave out the longshoremen and other workers who work at the port who are directly impacted as well. And we'll get into that a little more later. Some additional information about the impact of port pollution. Some refer to it as soot. Soot is a form of port pollution, that exposures to Latinos is reportedly 75% higher than white residents in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions. And then in terms of Black Americans, the highest risk of dying from soot pollution exposure on a per person basis, with a rate that is more than triple that of white Americans. So when we talk about disparity, numbers do not lie. Next slide. And so when we talk about emission reductions, commitments from New York and New Jersey Port Authority, what commitments have been made? So far, there's the Port of New York, New Jersey has committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. To reduce port emissions, the New Jersey, New York Port is investing in electrification. And so you'll see throughout this presentation, a common theme is that electrification is the most expedient and effective way to reduce port pollution and again, address the impact on environmental justice and other non-port communities. And so there's 3 bullets highlighting some other commitments they have made. As you can see, the Port of New York, New Jersey was the first, put its first electric truck into service in 2019. And then 10 more heavy-duty battery electric yard tractors were unveiled in 2021. And so we look forward to some more growth in that area. A question, rhetorical really, who can help the Port New York, New Jersey reach their goals? That's a question that everyone in this webinar should ask themselves. Who should be included? So we gave some examples, and of course, there's many more. I see some of them are in the room today. Members of the Good Jobs, Clean Air Coalition, members of the Moving Forward Network, Coalition for Healthy Ports, who's been doing an amazing job, Parents Engaging Parents New Jersey, of course, Friends of the Earth, and local state EJ leaders and stakeholders from EJ communities, meaning it takes really everybody coming to the table. Next slide, please. And so talk about support from US federal government and how really this is an unprecedented time. When you talk about the Justice 40, and I encourage all to just Google Justice 40 and take time to review the content that comes up and how this administration has prioritized EJ communities in terms of funding opportunities around not just climate justice, but specifically environmental justice as well. And so you'll hear more about this from my colleague, Sarah, who will be up next, about these different funding opportunities. But from Friends of the Earth, we wanted to definitely point out to our port community and of course to our EJ community, the $3 billion in green port funding that the EPA will administer under Section 60102 of the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA. Next slide, please. Endless possibilities for New York and New Jersey ports. That's the second largest port in the country. Many of us have heard the great advancements, and we'll get into that in a little bit about the West Coast, particularly California. And so we expect on the East Coast that New York and New Jersey, not just because I'm from New Jersey, but will be a trailblazer in terms of advancing our ports around zero emissions. Results from New York, New Jersey, you've heard specifically. Those that we would like to point out is the fine particulate matter is in the air, pollutant, and that it is a concern for health when levels are high in the air. And so we want folks to understand exactly what that means and the impact that it has on our brains. And so that is the health impact on folks from our community as a result of things that we haven't done that we can do. New York and New Jersey opportunities. And so it talks about the $150 million benefits, which Sarah will get into, but what we wanted to highlight is the benefit from full electrification. And part of it is coming up with a plan of how we get there, right? But reductions will be 69% for New York, New Jersey, which is dramatically high and is a major step forward. Reduce PM 2.5 emissions, New York, New Jersey by 30%. If we was just to electrify our technologies, electrifying the harbor craft alone, again, 30% respectfully. And then you see, again, full electrification, and the decrease is significantly goes from 2.17, 2.3 kilometers to 504.5 kilometers. Again, we'll share these slides, and then below is a little key so you can understand for those that may not, what levels are safe and what our current standards are. When we talk about growth opportunities for electrification, East versus West, just a few things we want to highlight. That no one and not one port can do everything as fast as we all may want it to be done, or that it should have been done. However, the Port of Los Angeles have done some innovative things that we want to point out that we think can work here. When we talk about their Gateway project, and there's some information there. And the Gateway project is a sophisticated way of using technology to help direct cargo owners, truckers, and drayage drivers to reduce congestion around the port. I know those who are from the South or the North can understand that, and Elizabeth, New Jersey, and those who live around the New York port area as well. Their vessel speed reduction program and the alternative maritime power program. All of those programs are unique and have been effective for them. And again, something for us to look at over here in New Jersey and New York. And we also shared the TAP program from San Pedro Bay ports as well. Next slide, please. We want to talk about accountability. Some folks approach to campaigning for environmental justice communities or campaigning against polluters is simply to just attack the polluter or shame the polluter. And Friends of the Earth, we want to take a different approach. We want to take an approach where we really just want to be a part of helping provide technical support, helping to address the feedback from environmental justice communities and even poor communities that there's a lot of complication in terms of applying for EPA grants. And so we want to be a support to that. But we also want to say this, that we cannot legislate morality. And so this example here from July 8th of 2022, where, as we just said, how forward California has been and really a trailblazer in terms of greening their port, they also had to be held accountable by organizations that's like yours that's on this call, and like individuals like myself, advocates, because again, we can't legislate for morality. So we have rules and regulations that's on the books to protect us overburdened communities, and yet polluters will continue to violate. And so you have support organizations like myself and other advocacy groups that will sue, as in this case, and the judge ruled in the favor of the community. And so we don't present this as a threat, but really as an accountability tool and a motivation to say that EJ communities, we have your back. Port authorities, we also have your back. in terms of us offering legal support for things, for regulations that are already on the books, but also being able to focus some more energy on getting new laws and strengthening regulations that we already have. So the short end is that we want to be a bridge over these troubled waters. We want to help bridge the gap, but do know that we do have support in place. We have the law, we have laws on our side that many have fought for over the past 20 years to hold folks who continue to pollute our community with no regard accountable. Next slide, please. Just want to highlight a few of our partners and some of the work we're doing in terms of, well, when you say you want to bridge the gap, how can you do that and how are you doing that? And so we are working in North Carolina. We are working with CCRAP on installing purple air monitors around those type of communities that we talked about, environmental justice communities, port communities, and communities that experience a lot of diesel trucks or diesel based traffic. Earth Justice and the work we're doing with them, again, around the soot rule, which we talked a little bit about. The Harambe House, a big shout out to Harambe House. We're working to implement a network of air monitors in West Savannah neighborhoods, and we will be installing in additional neighborhoods as well. Skipping over to the University of Maryland Center and the Southbound Environmental Alliance, who during Earth Week is continuing their truck count, doing great work around Newark and the Newark Port. Pacific Environment, and also Parents Engaging Parents, which is our social justice Parents Engaging Parents partner, allowing us to organize parents in EJ communities throughout the state of New Jersey who are ready to advocate, but also work with both EJ groups that are active in their community and also ports from a community perspective in terms of being a voice at the table. Next slide, please. How can we help NJ ports? EPA engagement, we talked about technical research, electrification, education, shipping, training and education support, infrastructure, transitional support, and port engagement. How can we help you? Who can we help connect you to? Next slide. Is also an approach that we're taking in terms of engaging and offering supports to ports for our EJ communities. Local advocacy, advice in terms of policy advisement, training, again, on EJ training for local EJ groups in terms of state and federal lobby efforts, local and state support, like we just talked about with some of the EJ groups up and down the Mid-Atlantic area. And you see examples of programs there. It goes back to education. It goes back to establishing clean air zones and setting standards within your community. And then it goes back to this. Engagement. How can Friends of the Earth help your port authority or help your environmental justice group or community? Next slide. And finally, we have our Environmental Justice Ambassador Program. So the idea is for Friends of the Earth to not be the movement, but support the movement. And so those organizations who we fund, those folks who are advocates on the ground and may not have an organization or a local social or environmental justice group, we can help you connect to that. But also our partners, assigning your EJ person to some of our workshops and to be a voice on the ground in these different regions will be a big help to ensuring that we can effectively help ports and EJ communities not just apply for funding, but submit competitive grants. Next slide. And so up next is Sarah, and then followed by that, we'll have questions. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Terrence. Your work is inspirational. I think Teresa's going to assist me today and run slides. But what I was just planning to do is give a brief overview of the Ports Initiative program and some of those resources we have to support diesel, emissions reductions at ports from diesel equipment, and funding opportunities that are coming out, and some technical resources that can really help stakeholders be in a better position to identify those emissions reduction projects and apply for funding, which, as some of the other speakers have mentioned, it's a really exciting time. Just sort of big picture, the next slide, Teresa. EPA's Ports Initiative, if you're not familiar with it, it's a partnership program that we've had for a while now at EPA, focused on addressing emissions from the concentration of diesel equipment at ports. So if you've heard other speakers talk about this, this is both water side, the harbor craft and the ocean going vessels that are coming into port, as well as the land side, cargo handling equipment, rail operations, truck operations. And through the Ports Initiative team at EPA, both at headquarters where I work and our 10 regional offices across the country, what we've been doing is sort of partnering and providing tools and assistance to accelerate the adoption of clean technologies, but also these planning practices listed here, things like emissions inventories and clean air plans and community engagement that we know can support stakeholders in making really informed clean air and climate investments. So again, I'm going to focus today on some funding opportunities and some technical resources. So next slide, the money slide, right? We know funding is really crucial to emissions reductions efforts. And I would be jumping for joy. Like, we're very, very excited about this new opportunity in the Inflation Reduction Act, $3 billion that EPA will use to fund grants and rebates for the deployment of zero emissions technology related planning efforts, like planning and permitting for deploying those zero emissions technologies. And we can also fund the development of climate action plans at ports. So on the slide, it's the more details to come, because we are right now in the process of sorting out implementation steps. What was that, Terrence? Oh, you weren't asking. Okay. And I was looking at the list of participants today, and I just want to thank many of you who've already provided input on the program design. We had some listening sessions in the fall and a request for information that closed in January with a lot of great input. And we are about to go out with another technical, this is going to be a slightly different, but a technical request for information very soon, where we're going to be collecting detailed information on things like current prices of zero emissions vehicles and equipment and the type of infrastructure they would need, as well as the availability of domestically produced infrastructure among sort of potential topic areas. So all of this is to say, please keep sending your input our way. At the end of this presentation, there'll be I'll share some contact information, including a helpline box, ecleanports@epa.gov, where we welcome people to continue to send us input on how we design this new $3 billion program. And then I'll also make a pitch to sign up for our Ports Initiative newsletter. That's where we'll be sharing updates on the program, as well as other funding opportunities. And there are a lot to support efforts to reduce diesel pollution at ports. One of them I wanted to mention is EPA's own Diesel Emission Reduction Act program, or DERA, because that notice of funding opportunity will be coming out very soon. And we've, as this sort of picture on the slide shows, we've been really successful in attracting good port applications through this program. We give, through the DERA program, priority to ports and goods movement projects, as well as those applicants who are doing those kinds of clean air planning practices we think help pave the way for longer term emissions reductions, things like emissions inventory and clean air plans, and engaging community. So we will continue to try to connect our stakeholders to the many funding opportunities going on. There's a link here to our webpage where we have a table with like over 70 funding opportunities. I would say don't go there right now. In a few weeks, we're going to be making a big update with lots of information about funding opportunities. I'll be honest, it's such a historic time. We could not keep up with all the new funding announcements, but I think we're going to be ready to go live very soon with an updated table. But as others on this call have mentioned, unprecedented levels of funding, billions of dollars from the bipartisan infrastructure law and IRA that will be flowing to the port sector. DOT, for example, will be rolling out some new programs that some of my other panelists have mentioned, and I'll highlight again, that can help support port electrification. But then just sort of to flag, there's these traditional DOT infrastructure funding programs that some may have heard of, like RAISE and MEGA. They also have new criteria that prioritize projects that address things like climate change and equity concern. So going to the next slide, just a flavor of a few examples of programs that were in the bipartisan infrastructure law or at least Terrence, maybe Brian mentioned the Port Infrastructure Development Program, which had actually been around for a few years. But what the bipartisan infrastructure law did was add more funding for the program and also explicitly call out new eligible project types: cleaner port equipment, port electrification planning. So right now there is a notice of funding opportunity open. I think it goes through April 28th, and you'll see that there's future year funding as well. Very soon, I think FHWA will be releasing the first notice of funding opportunity for a new program established in the bipartisan infrastructure law, the reduction of truck emissions at port facilities. So you'll see here, this is funding to not just deploy projects, but also to test and evaluate technologies focused on port truck, dray truck emissions reductions. And I'll just note that some of the funding amounts on the slide here, this is what was in the bipartisan infrastructure law, but they're regularly augmented by annual appropriations that the agencies receive for these programs. So the actual funding will be greater than what's on the slide. And then the last one here, I just mentioned kind of an illustrative example. There is a new program funding electric or low emitting ferries. The first notice of funding opportunity already closed. They've awarded some projects that kind of bundled it with other ferry funding programs, but there will be future opportunities as well. And I think at the point I just want to make before I dive in here is to some of Port District resources is that we really think and hope that some of the materials we've created in our program can support port applicants in, again, identifying good emissions reduction projects and meeting some of this new funding criteria. So the next slide is some examples of technical resources we've developed to really help port stakeholders identify clean air investments that make sense for their unique situation and operations. And that includes very much the priorities and goals that local residents may have around that port operation. So the first resource here is a 2016 National Port Strategy Assessment, and that looked at a range of emission reduction strategies that were available at the time of publication of that report to address diesel pollution, things like shore power and replacing older diesel fleets, operational improvements to reduce idling. And then in 2018, we published a collaborative report with Port Everglades, showcasing lessons learned and methods that other ports can use to develop emissions inventories and to conduct sort of scenario analysis to make evaluations of what potential emissions reductions benefits that could achieve from implementing different strategies. And then this third one here is guidance on how to develop port emissions inventories. We updated that, I think, just the last year. I think many on this call or this webinar know how important inventories can be, not just for identifying opportunities to reduce emissions, but also to track progress toward decarbonization and clean air goals. And then this last resources that we published, a really detailed assessment of shore power to help port stakeholders evaluate that specific technology. So we first published it in 2017, and then on the next slide, we just updated it last year, at the end of last year. And that it has now information on shore power systems in place since 2017, including growth at existing ports, as well as new installations that are planned in places like Miami and Galveston. And in addition to kind of highlighting some of those new projects, the report also summarizes information about that, some of which Teresa covered, updates to the CARB regulations that really included new shore power requirements that are expanding participation at California ports. And then the report also has information on vessel readiness and real world costs. My favorite part is the brief case studies and lessons learned from CARB, as well as individual port operators who've been using shore power and have a lot of tips to share with other ports that are exploring this technology. And then the next slide. Oh, I guess I should mention, I'll go back to the previous slide. We also have a calculator to estimate emissions reductions, emissions benefits from shore power. And we updated that last year as well, just to update the electricity emissions factors and also to include new emissions factors for an expanded set of vessels and fuel types that we didn't have before. All right, now we can move on to the next slide, which is a different kind of resource, which is resources to help improve communication between communities and port operators, which we know can lead to more productive collaboration and planning efforts that we can really help ensure that these massive infrastructure investments we're talking about are made in a way that really addresses community concerns and priorities. As I mentioned earlier, this is an important criteria in many of the discretionary infrastructure grant programs at DOT, in our DERA program. This is good, a specific call out in the Inflation Reduction Act Clean Ports program legislation. So what these tools are built for is just to build the capacity not only of community groups, but also port operators and other state, local, federal agency staff. So we have a ports primer that's intended for communities. It's a 101 on how ports work. We've gotten feedback that it's a nice 101 for anyone who might be new to this port sector. And then there's a community action roadmap that outlines steps that communities can take to more effectively engage with port operators and other stakeholders. And we also have an EJ primer, which is a 101 on the history of EJ for port operators, and also sort of a companion good neighbor roadmap, which has steps that port operators can take to better engage with near port communities. And so we had piloted these tools in 4 different areas: Providence, Savannah, New Orleans, and Seattle. 2 case studies on those pilot projects, and in some other areas that are doing some great community port collaboration work and trying to draw out some lessons that those groups have learned, very simple things like a port operator, if you're going to be engaging a diverse community, you want to make sure to knock down those participation barriers for community representatives. So language translation, childcare, and those are really the sort of purpose of those case studies, is again to share lessons learned. And then on the next slide, I just wanted to highlight the best practices area of our website, where we've been curating information for all of those mobile source strategies that we've all been discussing, and then trying to include technical resources in those real world examples. And we plan to continue to curate this web area. We know the field will evolve and more zero emission technologies are coming online. So we'll keep updating this section to hopefully be a clearinghouse and resource. And then the last resource I wanted to mention is on the next slide, our interactive map, which highlights clean air practices at some of the busiest ports in the US. And what it does is just link to publicly available information on emissions inventories, emissions reduction targets, sort of emissions reduction activities and community engagement at these ports. And we were able to last year add a feature where you can sort of click a button and see which activities, either planned activities or activities underway, are of the zero emissions nature. And again, we hope that by making this information more easily accessible will help others who are exploring potential emissions reductions opportunities or other ways to enhance their climate and clean air planning practices, including very much engaging neighboring communities to do the kind of work that's really necessary to address EJ concerns. So I'll end with that. The next slide is just contact. I think I mentioned, please do, we'll make a plug to sign up for the newsletter. That'll be the way that we communicate a lot of updates, not just about our own Inflation Reduction Act Clean Ports program and DERA program, but other funding opportunities and other technical resources. If you do have thoughts, whether it's questions or input you have on the design of the new Clean Ports program, please do send it to cleanports@epa.gov. You're welcome to email me, but I'll tell you, I'm gonna email it to that help desk, because we really want to be thoughtful about collecting everybody's input and synthesizing it so it can inform the way that we design the program. And then the last link there is just to contacts in our 10 regional offices, which they're really great resources. I'm sure some of you are already working with those EPA team members, but they have a lot of local knowledge and enjoy connecting partners to different resources. So please do reach out to them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah and Terrence. And again, wonderfully on time. And we have all of our panelist audience members still with us. So thank you everyone for hanging in for those great presentations. I'm going to ask all of our speakers to come back on video. Brian, if you can join us when you can. And we are ready to go into Q&A. Thank you so much. And we've got about 6, 7 live questions, it looks like. So why don't we start with Priscilla? Priscilla's question came in over chat. Oh, wow, fancy, we can see you. So Priscilla asked, with policies focused on the reduction of air pollution in place, will more electric charging stations be put in place for electric cars? It's a great question, Priscilla. We talk about this a lot, that like first come first is policy, but then we're talking about comprehensive energy transformation at the ports. So I would open that up to all of the panelists. What does it look like to, start to reconsider the electric charging at ports? Maybe Brian or Sarah, if you want to start us off.
Maybe somebody else can take on the electric cars, but in Seattle, for instance, there is some interest in electric drayage trucks and setting up charging infrastructure nearby the port to support those efforts as they work to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. So as part of that strategy. And really, it also involves including the electric utility early and often. And so ICCT researchers in the heavy duty vehicle program have been engaged with Seattle City Light to help with this type of research on where you would put the infrastructure, how much you would need, and what the benefits are of that.
Yeah, those are really good points, Brian. And I mean, the answer to the question is it's happening. It's happening, and I hope it will be happening more and more rapidly, that we are deploying these charging facilities that will support electrification of more equipment. Even before these new pots of funds became available, our longstanding DERA program is now funding 2 projects at ports for electric dray trucks at Baltimore and Charleston. So those projects are underway. They're getting some great experience about how to integrate electric dray trucks into the fleet. But then there is, again, just an enormous pots of funds flowing to electrification. I know that, Priscilla, you were asking about cars, and this is not my area of expertise either. I think about ports all day, but I do hear the National Electric Vehicle Initiative, the NEVI program is doing just that, putting lots of funding out for states and others to deploy charging infrastructure for electric vehicles.
Thanks so much, Terrence or Teresa. Anything you want to add on this one?
No, I thought that was perfect.
Great. Well, Terrence, we're going back to you. So we have Erica and then Melissa. I see your hand up. I'll call on you next. So we have a question from Erica for Terrence. What have you found to be the biggest obstacles in the work you and your colleagues do? How do you plan to overcome those obstacles? How can people on this webinar help you overcome these obstacles?
Yeah, I think if I was to speak just specifically in terms of colleagues, folks who are both advocates and considered experts or environmentalists, is that, some of us have been doing this work for 20 years. Some of us have been engaged in the work for 10 years. And I think that what we all have to realize is that in order to accomplish things that have never been accomplished before, or to do things for the first time, in this instance, speaking about the work that needs to be done on particularly the Mid-Atlantic and the Mid-Atlantic region, is that we have to begin to think differently. We have to have conversations with folks that we weren't willing to have conversations with before, or that during those conversations in the past, we may have been hurt by. When we think about the relationships between EJ communities and ports, and the disconnect, right? When we think about New York and New Jersey, how the board meets in New York versus in New Jersey ever. And so how many Newark residents and Elizabeth, New Jersey residents who are the most impacted, right? And then there's other communities beyond Jersey City who are impacted by port pollution. And those conversations, there's a lack of access on the EJ side. And I think there's a lack of capacity from what I hear from some port leaders, but there's definitely more work that they can do in terms of community engagement around environmental work. And so that's some of the challenges. How do we plan to overcome it? By working with organizations who's willing to be the difference, by engaging in webinars like this one, by engaging in June in DC in the first Environmental Justice Lobby Day on, I believe it's June 13th, for the first time in 3 years. This is a new Congress to many EJ leaders across this country. So connecting with groups like Friends of the Earth and other groups who sponsor lobby days is how folks on this call can also help engaging. The politicians say the same thing. They need to hear from people from EJ communities. They need to hear from port leaders so that they could be compelled to sort of champion our cause.
Amazing answer, Terrence. I love it. Gave me goosebumps. All right, Melissa Miles, I see your hand up and we are going to take you off mute. Okay, so Melissa, you're unmuted on our side. If you can just unmute yourself and then ask your question. So sorry, Melissa, we're still seeing a mute button on your side. So if you can click the unmute button on the bottom of your box, please. Okay, Melissa, I'm so sorry. I tried, but if you can, we're going to try to troubleshoot this and bring you back in later if we can. Otherwise, Melissa, there we go.
This is Melissa. I did not raise my hand, so I'm not sure how that happened, but I didn't raise my hand. I don't, maybe my phone pressed it, things happen, but no, sorry.
Oh, no worries. Okay, great. Well, if you have a question, please feel free to drop it in the chat. Otherwise, we have a question in the chat from Madison White. I think this is from Sarah, a question for Sarah. Will the truck emissions program include UTRs or just drayage trucks?
Oh no, I'm pretty good at acronyms, but you've stumped me. UTRs. Does anybody on my panel know what that stands for? Well, what was that?
I was saying she got me on that one too, Sarah.
Okay, well, I'm glad I'm not the only one. I thought I just didn't have enough coffee today. I'm usually good with acronyms. And I'm not sure, there's two, I mentioned two programs. The one FHWA will be announcing very soon, the reduction of emissions from trucks at port facilities. The statute isn't specific about the type of trucks, so we'll see when that funding opportunity comes out, but it's a broad program to reduce pollution from trucks at ports. And then the Inflation Reduction Act Clean Ports program that EPA is implementing, that the Ports Initiative team is involved with. The legislation, the statute doesn't specify beyond that we are able to fund zero emissions technologies and equipment at ports. So obviously we've heard a lot of input and interest in zero emission dray trucks, probably UTRS, if I knew what it was, but we can come back to that if you want to put it in the chat, Madison.
So I think I'm on
utility tractor rigs. Thank you.
Yes, it is in there.
Yes. It's a really good question. And I don't know. So FHWA statute, I have not memorized. So I don't know if it has to be on-road trucks. That's often a distinction because you mentioned yard hustlers are often on non-road truck. Utility tractor rigs would probably be on road, but I guess the short answer is I don't know about really either program because the first notice of funding opportunity is not out, and but that kind of guidance will be there. If you want to send a comment about covering these technologies or not for the IRA Clean Ports program, please do send some written input to cleanports@epa.gov.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Madison. And just a reminder to everyone, we will be sending slides. So you'll have access to the email addresses shared. We have a question from Carla Hart. Hi, Carla, which is a question that is anyone aware of community level pollution fees assessed to cruise ships based on the monetized value of the pollution discharged while in port? Could serve to fund electrification of dirty old tour buses and other shore-based, as well as an incentive to use shore power. Love that question, Carla. I think I'll open it to panelists, but Brian, I know Brian's done some work on pollution fee analysis. So unless anyone else wants to go first, turn this one over to Brian.
We've run some numbers on how much revenue you could raise if you charged a fee on pollution from ships that are coming into U.S. ports. There are some assumptions that you can make out there on the social cost of carbon, and then also the monetized damages from a pound of particulate matter or NOx or otherwise. It's in the range of tens of billions of dollars, but it just depends on, you know, the scope that you're looking at. I don't know of any community level pollution fees that are assessed specifically to cruise ships. And I think part of it also depends on how big of a ship we're talking about. Most of the cruise ships that you might be thinking of are those that are foreign flagged and they're buying their fuel in places like Rotterdam, Singapore, other major bunkering hubs. And in that case, they're not paying any taxes on the fuel to the United States, for instance. If they're paying any taxes at all, usually not. And so even programs that might have a carbon price, for instance, in some of the states that we have in the United States, wouldn't be covered because the ship wouldn't be buying the fuel in the United States, for instance. Not sure if anybody else has any other insights, though.
Well, I'll use moderator's privilege here to say, Carla, the one pollution fee that we, on the Pacific Environment side, talk about a lot is the Norway NOx Fund, which was specifically a penalty imposed on NOx pollution from ships. I don't remember off the top of my head if cruise ships were included, but that's at least a model of a country that did, successfully implement a penalty on a particular pollutant to raise money for the zero emission shipping transition. We've done a lot of advocacy for other states or the US federal government to replicate that. So it's a great idea, and would love to follow up around how we could mobilize more support for that.
Mm-hmm. It would be legal, by the way. You could do it if you wanted to.
All right. We have a question from Michael around how can smaller ports in lower population areas justify investments in pollution reduction projects that increase public health benefits for a relatively smaller number of people? Sarah, I imagine this is a question EPA gets a lot, so over to you.
Although I think Brian raised his hand to answer. I'll start. But
After you.
I will look forward to hearing your response. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into sort of what community is deserving or most deserving of pollution abatement. There's a lot to consider, and this is something we as an agency grapple with in terms of making sure that our funding goes to those who need it the most. So obviously, indicators of sort of burden of air quality, obviously, if there are more people that are exposed to high levels of pollution, there's more benefit that you could provide by funding a project. But we also know that, if you're living across the fence line from these operations, it doesn't matter what your air shed is like. It doesn't matter, how many people you're getting exposed. And if you're in an area that's consistently been at a disadvantage for, not at the table for planning, has other burdens that have sort of caused harm to health. So anyway, I guess this is the long way of saying there's a lot of factors to consider, and that's certainly something we want input on as we think about where to prioritize funding.
I would just like to say, I'm not certain which small port you may be referencing or perhaps represent, but Friends of the Earth, we are focusing also on smaller ports within these regions. We know that small ports matter. We're looking at it from different perspectives. How can we meet ports where they are and help them articulate and tell their story? And then there's a second way besides that one-on-one engagement. So please reach out to me, email me. I hope we can share that information, contact information. But regional approach, if we can get several small ports together and collaborate on emissions, zero emissions plan, that is something that we can help to provide some guidance or advisement on. So again, there's some one-on-one support, and we're looking at, it's just about prioritizing smaller ports and smaller communities, knowing that all lives matter. And then also when it comes to environmental health, particularly, and then again, taking a regional approach, having some meetings and alliances formed with smaller ports, I think could be a significant step forward.
And here at the ICCT, the work that I just presented was funded by the Pisces Foundation, and they've generously given us a follow-on grant. And part of that work is going to be to help identify a port where there's a combination of significant air pollution, low income, and also in a non-attainment area. So an area that has higher levels of air pollution than other parts of the country. And when those things converge, then there could be opportunities for a really cost-effective investments in reducing port emissions to meet the goals of improving public health for everybody, providing technical support to smaller ports that may not have the bandwidth or expertise to do their own emissions inventories to calculate and monetize benefits, which can really help in the grant application process. And so part of the work that we've done has been, we did this specific port emissions inventories that I just presented on, but that requires going for each port, understanding what the different sources are and putting them into the models and then analyzing it. What we've done is we've looked at all of the ports in the United States, and we've used another model that ICCT has developed called the Systematic Assessment of Vessel Emissions model, where we looked at the emissions just from the ships when they're either at berth or at anchor in the ports. And we've done what we think is the first national port emissions inventory, where you're looking at the emissions contributions from ocean-going vessels specifically. And then we've paired that with census data. Income is not the only criteria that one should consider when trying to determine if there are environmental injustices going on. EPA has the EJ screen tool, so some supplemental analysis on the ports that we've identified, running it through EJ screen. Even that is not sufficient to really get a full picture. So the work that Terrence does, for instance, is in Pacific Environment, is really critical to engaging on the ground communities and community groups. But all of that to say, we're really interested in helping identify ports that really could use the funding that may never have the opportunity to actually put in a proposal. We're going to help write the proposal, work with the port to do it. And as Sarah mentioned, this is an unprecedented amount of funding, and we have a particular window that we know that these funds are going to be available for. So when we have to disperse funds every year, and the clock is ticking. I mean, Sarah was saying that the notice of funding opportunity for one of these programs expires in a couple of weeks, and then we'll have another one next year. So we need to get ready ahead of time and really make sure that all ports that are interested can have the opportunity to really meaningfully compete for these funds.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Brian. Well, we're at 20 minutes after 1 o'clock Pacific. So I think we're going to take our last question and then close us out. So last question will be from Tolani. I think it's a great way to sum up the conversation today, which is question, what would be the best way to advocate for this politically on a federal level with legislators in our states, especially if our state happens to be one of the major port locations? I'll let anyone jump in on that, but suggest we start with Terrence and Teresa.
Sure. Thanks for that great question, Talani. So as I mentioned, we have a Ports for People campaign. We're actually on our website. We have resources for communities and advocates, including our Ports Playbook. That's something that could be helpful in terms of talking points, as well as the reasons why we need to increase shipping decarbonization and electrifying ports. And yeah, I'll pass it over to Terrence.
Yeah, I would say there's definitely a benefit in collaborating in terms of EJ organizations with New York organizations. We could, there's some work that needs to be done individually, but aligning our goals, even knowing what New York organizations are doing to address the port challenges on their end versus what may be happening in Newark and Elizabeth, but then having some common lobbying. I think it takes, recognizing and addressing the governors, because they do appoint the board, the port commissioners. And I also think it takes being present in DC. And sometimes it's not it's operating or engaging outside of those lobby efforts. One thing that I heard during National Public Health Week consistently, when we asked the New Jersey delegation, how can we help you? Who do you need to hear from? And they said, we need to continue to hear from people like you, meaning the group. The group was not just the experts, but it was medical, not just environmental experts, but it was also or advocates, but it was also environmental health experts that was a part of that coalition, and several different EJ groups. Collaboration, I think, is key. Inviting them out to your sort of community meetings, putting the governors and the Congress folks and the House of Representative folks, our U.S. senators, on your coalition agendas and addressing them, letting them hear the different voices. They cannot hear it enough. They need the support. The last thing I would say is, sometimes we see environmental justice as just a democratic issue. I like to say, outside of campaigning, it's governing time. And so after that general election, when those folks are sworn in, Republicans represent me too. And I think that we want that to be a fact, a well-known fact in environmental justice communities, that we have to have conversations with people across the aisle, that we have to make it clear to the folks out in the Midwest and other states that might not understand what folks at EJ communities go through, that when they vote, and just because their constituent base may not value what we may be experiencing in New Jersey, for example, doesn't mean they don't have an obligation to engage and represent our best interests. And so it takes, again, engaging our local politicians, empowering them with the support that they need, but also us utilizing our voice, not just in general elections, but in the halls, the Congress halls, in a general way as well.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, Brian, Teresa, and Terrence, for your research, for your advocacy, for your management of historic levels of funds. This is an exciting time in the zero emission port transformation. And thank you, everyone, so much for being here. For our attendees, from community to policy, we're going to get this done. So again, as I said, we will be sending all the slides around. I know there were a lot of questions here about email addresses. So yeah, all of those will be shared with you shortly, as well as, I think, a recording of this, though maybe I'm wrong, but nevertheless, slides most importantly will come, and look forward to continued collaboration on the zero emission port transformation here in the US and beyond. And we're going to give you back a few minutes of your day. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.